Carl Jung never believed that true self-love could be manufactured by repeating hollow lines into a mirror. Standing in front of your reflection each morning, whispering, "I am enough," while secretly doubting it. This, to him, was a performance, not a transformation. Real self-love, Jung taught, is something far more unsettling. It is born in those moments when you are forced to face the darker corners of your psyche, the shadow as he called it. Those hidden traits you've pushed down, the instincts and impulses you were taught to smother because someone, somewhere, told you they were unacceptable. This idea becomes clearer if we step back and consider the way most of us were raised. From childhood onward, society conditions us to curate a version of ourselves that feels palatable. In classrooms across America in the 1950s, boys were told not to cry because it made them weak, while girls were told to be polite, obedient, and never too outspoken. In Europe, particularly in Jung's Switzerland, religious traditions reinforced the same message. The parts of ourselves that appeared unruly, angry, or vulnerable needed to be tucked away. To fit in, one had to carve off pieces of their authentic self. Think of a child labeled too much, too loud, too sensitive, too curious. The world whispers that these traits are burdens rather than gifts, so the child learns to bury them deep. That is the beginning of the shadow. And though those traits are buried, they do not die. They remain alive under the surface, shaping thoughts, cravings, and fears in adulthood. Jung compared it to a river diverted underground. It may disappear from sight, but it continues to flow, reshaping the land from beneath. This explains why so many adults find themselves carrying a heavy sense of contradiction. Outwardly, they are polished, accomplished, seemingly in control. Inwardly, they wrestle with an unnamed emptiness, as if a part of themselves has been exiled. This exile, Jung argued, is the very reason so many modern ideas of self-love feel shallow. Positive affirmations, self-help mantras, or even carefully curated social media personas cannot reach into the depths of the unconscious. They skim the surface, offering temporary comfort, while leaving the deeper wound untouched. And this is where Jung departed from many of his contemporaries, including Freud. Freud often looked for pathology, disorders to be cured, symptoms to be managed. Jung, by contrast, believed these hidden aspects of self were not enemies to be eradicated, but guides to transformation. To him, the shadow was not simply a container of shameful impulses. It also held creativity, vitality, and strength. What we repress is often the very thing that could make us whole. Consider the broader cultural climate of Jung's era. The early 20th century was obsessed with respectability. Industrial cities demanded order, conformity, and productivity. Families presented polished images to neighbors and churches, carefully concealing scandal or struggle. Against this backdrop, Jung's insistence on facing inner chaos seemed radical, even dangerous. Yet he knew that ignoring these shadows only ensured they would appear elsewhere, sometimes in destructive relationships, sometimes in collective movements of hatred and projection. It is striking how relevant his insight remains. Even today, the world markets self-love as a commodity. Advertisements promise confidence through a new fragrance, a new diet, a new routine. Influencers preach positivity while concealing their own turmoil behind ring lights and filters. But Jung's voice cuts through that noise, reminding us that authentic self-love cannot be bought or faked. It emerges only when we dare to turn inward and confront the parts of ourselves we least want to see. And that confrontation, though terrifying, is also the doorway. The child who was once told they were too emotional may discover in their shadow a profound empathy for others. The one dismissed as too intense may uncover a drive that fuels leadership. What was buried, once brought to light, becomes not a weakness, but a strength. That is why Jung described facing the shadow as the first step toward individuation, the long journey toward becoming whole. At this stage of the story, we stand at the threshold. The illusions of self-love, Those surface affirmations and polished masks are beginning to crumble. What remains is a question whispered in the silence. Are you willing to look at the parts of yourself you've hidden the longest? Because only there, in the discomfort, does real transformation begin. Jung's idea of the shadow was not an abstract metaphor, but a living force inside every human being. He described it as the sum of all those qualities, desires, and impulses we hide from others, and, most dangerously, from ourselves. It might include envy, rage, lust, or selfishness, but it also includes vitality, imagination, and courage, the very elements of our personality that did not receive permission to exist. To Jung, the shadow was like a locked attic in a family house, filled with both monsters and treasures. We rarely open the door, but its contents shape the life of the household all the same. This concept is not unique to psychology. It echoes across myth, religion, and literature. The Greeks told the story of Pandora, who opened a forbidden jar and released chaos upon the world, yet also hope. The Hebrews described the exile of Adam and Eve after they tasted forbidden knowledge. Shakespeare gave us characters like Macbeth, undone not by external enemies, but by the ambition he tried to suppress until it consumed him. Jung believed these stories endured precisely because they mirrored something universal. The parts of ourselves that we deny do not vanish. They return, wearing different faces, demanding recognition. Where Freud had emphasized the battle between primal instincts and social norms, Jung shifted the emphasis. For him, the shadow was not merely a repository of destructive urges. It was also the birthplace of creativity. Consider the artist whose parents dismiss drawing as a waste of time. He grows up, takes a respectable job, but feels drained and restless. That creative spark lives in his shadow, waiting to be acknowledged. Or the young woman taught to never express anger. She becomes endlessly accommodating, but at the cost of boundaries. Her suppressed anger festers until it bursts out in ways she cannot control. In both cases, the shadow is not the enemy. It is the uninvited guest whose knock grows louder the longer we ignore it. Jung himself was haunted by his shadow. After breaking with Freud in the early 1910s, he plunged into what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious. He recorded visions, dreams, and inner dialogues in what became the famous Red Book. There he confronted terrifying images, serpents, floods, demonic figures. But he also found symbols of renewal, gardens, guiding voices, and radiant light. He learned firsthand that descent into the shadow is both dangerous and necessary. One cannot rise without first descending. This lesson resonates strongly with the cultural climate of the 20th century. Europe was convulsed by wars that revealed collective shadows, nationalism, prejudice, the urge for domination. Jung argued that just as individuals repress their unacceptable traits, so too do nations. What a society denies in itself, it projects onto others. This is why entire populations could be persuaded to see enemies everywhere, because the shadow within had not been faced. Even in personal relationships, the same mechanism operates. If someone has buried their own insecurity, they may become hypersensitive to arrogance in others. If they have repressed their capacity for anger, they may attract partners who express rage openly, living out what they cannot. Jung explained that this is why relationships are often so emotionally charged. We are not just meeting another person, we are meeting our shadow in their reflection. But here lies the paradox. The shadow terrifies us precisely because it contains truths we cannot bear to admit. Yet those truths are the path forward. A man who finally admits his jealousy may learn to value his relationships more deeply. A woman who acknowledges her resentment may discover the courage to claim her independence. The very qualities we fear hold the seeds of our healing. To face the shadow is to risk seeing oneself without filters, without excuses. It is the work of stripping away masks and illusions. Jung believed that many people avoid this work, preferring the comfort of projection and denial. But he also believed that without it, life becomes a cycle of repetition, the same conflicts, the same disappointments, the same wounds playing out again and again until the shadow is faced. This is the ground we now stand on. A recognition that the shadow is not some external curse, but an intimate part of our humanity. We inherit it from childhood, carry it into adulthood, and project it onto the world. The question is not whether we have a shadow. The question is whether we will have the courage to meet it, and in meeting it, discover the deeper wholeness waiting on the other side. If the shadow is the hidden part of the self, then our relationships often become its stage. Jung observed that what we cannot accept in ourselves, we unconsciously seek out or battle against in others. In this way, attraction is rarely random. It is patterned, almost scripted, by the unresolved wounds and unacknowledged truths we carry within. This is why so many people find themselves living the same painful story with different characters. A woman leaves a neglectful partner only to fall for another who withholds affection. A man breaks up with a partner who belittles him, only to find his next girlfriend uses the same cutting words. Friends shake their heads, asking, "Why does this keep happening?" But Jung had an answer. Because life itself is holding up a mirror, insisting that we face what has been left unhealed. Modern psychology has given this pattern new names: trauma bonding, attachment styles, repetition compulsion, but Jung captured its essence a century ago. He insisted that the people who hurt us most deeply are not merely villains in our story, they are messengers. They force into the open the very parts of ourselves we have buried. If you carry the belief that you are unworthy of love, you will find yourself drawn, again and again, to those who confirm it. Not because you consciously want suffering, but because your psyche longs to resolve the old wound. This principle has played out across history, not just in individual lives. Consider the royal marriages of Europe. Dynasties often bound themselves to partners who reinforced their own hidden insecurities. French kings marrying for political validation, English queens tethered to alliances that magnified their doubts. These unions, filled with betrayal and unrest, reflected not just politics, but the unconscious fears of nations. What was unhealed in a culture re-emerged in the marriages of its rulers. In today's world, the patterns appear in subtler ways. A man who grew up unseen by his parents may scroll endlessly through dating apps, desperate for validation, matching with people who offer only fleeting attention. A woman who was once told she was too much may shrink herself in every relationship, choosing partners who prefer her silence over her voice. Each dynamic is a repetition, a shadow reenactment disguised as romance. But here is where Jung offered hope. To recognize the pattern is to loosen its grip. The moment you ask, "Why am I drawn to this? What part of me is being reflected back?" you step outside the endless loop. Suddenly, the story is no longer a curse, but a lesson. Pain becomes a teacher. Repetition becomes revelation. Jung often reminded his students that what we call fate is usually our unconscious at work. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This truth can feel uncomfortable, even cruel. Yet it is profoundly liberating. If the cycles we repeat are not imposed from outside, but arise from within, then transformation is possible. We are not prisoners of destiny, we are participants in it. There is a curious detail here. The people we meet at these crossroads often arrive with uncanny timing. Just when we think we've escaped, the familiar pattern reappears, wearing a new face. Jung would not have been surprised. He believed life itself arranges such encounters, synchronicities meant to awaken us. The universe is not punishing us. It is conspiring to heal us, if only we are willing to see. And so, patterns of attraction are not accidents. They are mirrors, crafted with precision, designed to reveal what we have buried. The question is not whether these patterns will appear. They always do. The question is whether we will remain blind to them or finally turn to face the shadow they reflect. Few experiences cut deeper than the quiet hunger for validation. Jung saw it everywhere, in the patient who felt invisible in childhood and now begged for love as an adult, in the ambitious professional who chased achievements not for joy but for proof of worth. Beneath these pursuits lay a haunting truth. When we do not give ourselves love, we look to others to supply it, and what they give will always feel fragile, conditional, incomplete. This is why so many people exhaust themselves in relationships. They wait for someone else to deliver the very thing they have withheld from themselves. A man tells himself, if she finally commits, then I'll feel secure. A woman whispers, if he compliments me more, then I'll feel beautiful. Yet the moment the partner falters, the illusion crumbles, because the real deficit was never out there, it was inside. Jung's insight was as sharp as it was unsettling. No one can give you what you are unwilling to give yourself. If you carry an emptiness within, the love you receive will always feel like a reflection of that void. If you carry fullness, the love you receive will echo that abundance. Life mirrors what you carry in your depths. This principle plays out not just in intimate bonds, but across culture. In the Victorian era, women were trained to see marriage as the ultimate source of identity, their worth tied to whether a husband praised or ignored them. Men, too, were told their value lay in external proof: titles, property, lineage. Today, the same hunger is repackaged through social media. The glowing screen has replaced the parlor room, but the craving is unchanged. Each like functions as a modern curtsy, each follower a fragile validation. Yet just as in the past, no amount of applause can quiet the internal voice that whispers, "You are not enough." But Jung did not frame this realization as despair. For him, it was a turning point. To recognize that no one else can complete you is not a sentence of loneliness, but the beginning of liberation. When you begin to love yourself, fully, honestly, not with vanity, but with acceptance, something remarkable occurs. The frantic need for approval loosens its grip. You stop begging for scraps of affection because you no longer believe your love is a commodity to be bartered. Instead, you begin to share it as something sacred, something already whole within you. Imagine the shift. A woman who once tolerated indifference because she feared abandonment suddenly realizes her love is not to be rationed to those who cannot value it. A man who once hustled for attention recognizes that his presence alone carries worth. Their energy changes. They walk differently, speak differently. And as Jung predicted, when your vibration shifts, so too does the world around you. People who once drained you drift away, and space opens for those who match your new frequency. This change can feel brutal at first. Friends leave, lovers pull back, circles shift. The old self grieves, fearing loss. But in truth, it is not abandonment. It is cleansing. The people who could only connect with your wounds cannot follow you into your healing. What remains are those who see you not as a project to be fixed, but as a being already whole. Yet even here, Jung warned, fear lingers. The silence that follows can feel like a test. Nights stretch longer. Doubt whispers, "Did I make a mistake? Should I have stayed?" But in that silence lies the true encounter, the meeting with the self. There, in solitude, a person discovers the astonishing truth. They were never truly lacking. They were never incomplete. The love they begged for was always waiting, quietly, within. It is in this discovery that the search for validation ends. No longer a beggar, no longer a chaser, you become someone who chooses, and with that choice, everything begins to transform. When the foundations of self-love finally take root, the world does not remain the same. It cannot. Something subtle but unmistakable shifts. The air feels lighter, conversations sharper, and relationships clearer. Jung described this as an energetic transformation, a change in vibration. What once drew you in now repels you, and what once seemed distant suddenly feels near. The people who filled your life when you lived in need begin to fall away, not because you push them, but because the invisible thread that once bound you together has been cut. At first, this loss can feel cruel. A best friend stops calling, a partner grows distant, family members seem uncomfortable around your new clarity. The temptation is to cling, to beg them to return to the old script. But Jung insisted this stage is essential. Healing always involves a shedding. Just as trees must let go of leaves in autumn to survive the winter, we too must release relationships that cannot survive our new frequency. What looks like abandonment is often a form of pruning. The soul is clearing space for what must come next. History offers countless examples of this dynamic at work. Consider the great social revolutions, the civil rights movement, women's suffrage, anti-colonial struggles. Individuals who chose dignity and self-worth over fear inevitably lost old companions. Friends drifted, neighbors turned hostile, entire communities rejected them. Yet out of those losses emerged new circles, new allies, people who matched the higher vibration of courage and truth. The same principle that reshaped nations operates quietly in each of our personal lives. Jung saw this process not as a sentimental unfolding, but as a confrontation with reality. He warned that genuine self-love is not soft or indulgent, it is fierce. It demands boundaries, it demands truth. It means no longer dimming your light for those who find it too bright. Imagine a woman who once apologized for her ambitions finally pursuing them without guilt. Or a man who once let others exploit his kindness finally saying no without shame. These are not acts of arrogance, they are acts of alignment. They reflect the recognition that love, to be real, must start within. And with that alignment comes a new magnetism. The friendships and loves that enter at this stage feel different. They are not built on desperation or pretense, but on choice. A man who no longer fears solitude does not chase partners who toy with his insecurities. A woman who honors her worth no longer accepts half-hearted love. They both attract people who recognize their fullness because they themselves now live from it. This transformation does not mean life becomes free of pain. Jung never promised that. Fear still visits, doubts still whisper, loneliness still knocks at the door. But the difference is in the foundation. The storms that once toppled you now only bend you. You no longer crumble at rejection because you no longer confuse it with proof of unworthiness. You no longer panic when people leave because you understand some were never meant to stay. The cultural echo of this transformation is striking. In the 1960s, American counterculture began preaching love yourself as a form of resistance against conformity. While often dismissed as naive, this movement reflected Jung's deeper truth. When individuals honor their inner worth, they disrupt systems built on fear and control. A society of people who love themselves authentically cannot be manipulated by shame or scarcity. In that sense, self-love is not merely personal. It is revolutionary. Jung believed this transformation was the threshold of individuation, the journey of becoming who you truly are, beyond masks, beyond projections. It is the point where life stops being a desperate search for approval and becomes an exploration of authenticity. At this stage, relationships are not chosen from hunger, but from fullness. You no longer ask, "Who will complete me?" but instead, "Who will walk with me?" And that is the quiet miracle of self-love. It reshapes not just how you see yourself, but how the entire world responds to you. The people who remain are those who nourish, empower, and uplift. The ones who arrive see not a wound to exploit, but a light to walk beside. The old life fades, but in its place rises something new, something aligned, something true. No transformation unfolds without friction. Jung understood that the most powerful lessons often arrive cloaked in pain. A betrayal, a rejection, a sudden loss. These are the moments that feel like life itself has turned hostile. Yet for Jung, such experiences were not punishments, but mirrors, reflecting back the wounds we had refused to face. Think of the friend who disappears when you need them most. At first, it feels like abandonment, a cruel reminder that you are alone. But when the sting fades, another truth emerges. Perhaps you had long ignored your own voice, placing everyone else's needs before your own. Their absence forces you to ask why you believed loyalty required self-erasure. The pain becomes a teacher, pointing to the boundary you never learned to set. History abounds with similar stories. Consider Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher. His reign was marked by betrayal from within his circle, invasions at the empire's borders, and relentless loss. Yet from those trials came his meditations, a private journal where he wrestled with suffering and found wisdom. Or look to the Buddha, whose entire spiritual path began when he finally left the palace walls and confronted sickness, aging, and death. Pain has always been the portal to awakening. Jung insisted that projection is the key to understanding suffering. When someone disappoints us, they are not just hurting us. They are activating something we have yet to heal. A lover's betrayal may awaken an old wound of abandonment from childhood. A colleague's arrogance may sting because it mirrors the pride we have suppressed in ourselves. The external event is real, yes, but its sting is magnified by what we carry inside. That is why two people can experience the same event and walk away with entirely different scars. But here lies the challenge. Most people never look inward. They stop at blame. They point to the betrayer, the deceiver, the cruel hand of fate, and say, "This is why I suffer." Jung warned that this response traps us in victimhood. True healing requires a harder question. What is this teaching me about myself? It is a question that demands courage because it refuses the easy refuge of blame. Yet only here does transformation begin. Consider how this plays out in relationships. A woman discovers her partner has been unfaithful. She could spend years consumed by anger, replaying his lies, rehearsing her outrage. Or she could eventually ask, "Why did I stay when the signs were there? What belief about my worth kept me silent?" The betrayal still wounds, but it also illuminates. It reveals the hidden script she had been following unconsciously. Cultures across the world have long echoed this truth. In Japanese aesthetics, the practice of kintsugi repairs broken pottery with veins of gold, making the fracture the most beautiful part of the vessel. In Christianity, the crucifixion, an event of unbearable pain, becomes the doorway to resurrection. In each case, suffering is not erased, it is transformed. The wound becomes the path. Jung believed that if we fail to recognize this, life will repeat the lesson. The same disappointments will appear again, only louder. The same betrayals will cycle back with new faces. He wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Pain ignored becomes destiny. Pain confronted becomes liberation. It is tempting to hope for a life without such tests. But Jung would argue that a life without suffering is also a life without depth. The shadow must be faced, and pain is often the only guide strong enough to lead us there. It is not that we should welcome suffering for its own sake. Rather, we should learn to listen when it arrives. To ask, even through tears, what truth is this moment asking me to see? And so the lessons hidden in pain are not curses. They are invitations. They remind us that the journey of self-love is not a path lined with roses, but a pilgrimage through valleys of loss and nights of doubt. Each wound, if we dare to face it, carries within it the seed of transformation. The question is whether we will allow the pain to define us or refine us. For Jung, the destination of this long inner journey was what he called individuation, the process of becoming your truest, most authentic self. It was not about becoming perfect, nor about erasing flaws. Individuation meant weaving together every part of yourself, light and shadow, conscious and unconscious, until you stood whole. It was a rebirth into authenticity, where you no longer lived as a fragment, but as a complete being. In practical terms, individuation reshapes the way we love. Immature love, Jung explained, begins from hunger. It seeks a partner to fill the void, to soothe the insecurity, to complete what feels broken. This is the love of fairy tales, of half-souls searching for their missing piece, but such love quickly drains both people. It becomes a contract of desperation, a constant bargaining of attention and reassurance. Mature love, by contrast, arises when two whole people choose to walk side by side. It is not about fusion, but about companionship. It is not about erasing loneliness, but about sharing fullness. In such love, boundaries are not threats. They are respected. Freedom is not feared. It is celebrated. Each partner remains rooted in their own selfhood, yet their lives intertwine like branches of separate trees growing toward the same sun. Jung saw individuation as a universal calling, yet one uniquely lived by each individual. No two paths looked alike, because no two shadows were the same. For one person, the work might mean confronting long-suppressed anger. For another, it might mean reclaiming joy after years of repression. The journey is intimate, personal, but its goal is always the same: integration. This idea stands in sharp contrast to cultural expectations, both in Jung's time and our own. In early 20th century Europe, conformity was prized. People defined themselves by their roles: fathers, mothers, workers, citizens. Individual authenticity was sacrificed to the needs of the collective. Today, the pressures look different but echo the same theme. Social media rewards conformity disguised as uniqueness. Curated identities, filtered authenticity, 1,000 variations of the same performance. Jung's message cuts across the centuries. To individuate is to resist these pressures, to claim a self that is neither mask nor imitation, but truth. Consider how this process reshapes daily life. A man who has always sought validation through his career begins to ask whether his ambitions reflect his true desires or merely his need to impress. A woman who has spent years molding herself to please others begins to speak with a voice that is fully her own. These shifts ripple outward. They change how they parent, how they partner, how they lead. Individuation is not a private act. It transforms communities. History gives us vivid examples. Think of figures like Mahatma Gandhi, who shed the expectations of his British education and elite status to embrace simplicity and nonviolent resistance. Or Maya Angelou, who transformed personal trauma into poetry that gave voice to millions. These were not people who lived without fear or flaw. They were people who integrated their shadows into their strength, becoming whole, and in doing so changed the world. But Jung also warned that individuation demands courage. It requires letting go of the roles we cling to, the masks that once kept us safe. It requires stepping into solitude, facing the silence where the self waits. Not everyone chooses this path. Many live their entire lives behind facades, comfortable in repetition, afraid of the unknown. Individuation is not forced. It is chosen. Yet for those who walk it, the reward is profound. Relationships become less about need and more about choice. Work becomes less about survival and more about purpose. Life itself becomes less about performance and more about truth. To individuate is not to escape struggle, but to face it with integrity. It is to step into the world not as who you were told to be, but as who you truly are. And that is the essence of Jung's vision. The journey through shadow, pain, and transformation is not for the sake of survival alone. It is for the sake of becoming whole. Individuation is the alchemy of the soul, the weaving together of every broken piece into something unshakable, radiant, and free. Jung believed that before new life can take root, the old must collapse. Transformation rarely unfolds in peace and order. More often, it arrives through chaos. The very structures that once held us together begin to break apart, relationships dissolve, careers lose meaning, friendships fade. At first, this unraveling feels like disaster, but Jung insisted it was necessary. The psyche cannot evolve without shedding what no longer belongs. Chaos, in this sense, is not a punishment, but a cleansing fire. Think of the forest that must burn so new seeds can sprout, or the storm that clears the air of suffocating heat. Human lives follow the same pattern. Endings, though painful, carve out the space where beginnings can finally emerge. Many resist this stage, clinging to the familiar even as it decays. Yet Jung urged us to trust that the collapse is not the end of the story, but the prelude to transformation. And then, often at the very moment despair deepens, something uncanny begins to happen. Jung called it synchronicity, the meaningful coincidence. You think of an old friend, and they call. Call the next day, you struggle with a decision, and a book falls open to the very page that speaks to your dilemma. Skeptics dismiss these as chance, but Jung saw them as signs that the unconscious and the external world are not separate realms. They mirror one another, moving in alignment when the self shifts. Imagine someone who finally ends a toxic relationship. The silence feels unbearable. Days stretch into emptiness. But then, seemingly by accident, they meet a stranger at a cafe who shares a story of leaving behind their own destructive past. The conversation sparks a new sense of courage. This is not mere coincidence, Jung would argue. It is synchronicity, the universe echoing the inner transformation outward. History offers striking parallels. Think of how great discoveries often arrived in clusters, as if the world itself conspired to deliver them. In the late 19th century, scientists in different countries simultaneously unveiled the theory of evolution, the foundations of modern physics, the seeds of psychology. Jung saw these as collective synchronicities, moments when the unconscious of humanity stirred and produced breakthroughs across continents. In personal life, synchronicity often feels like magic. The job appears just as you finally let go of desperation. The mentor arrives just when you decide to change paths. These moments remind us that once we align with our authentic self, the world begins to align with us. It is not luck. It is not coincidence. It is the rhythm of the psyche and the universe moving in step. But this does not mean the path is easy. Chaos still wounds. Endings still hurt. Jung never denied the grief of letting go. What he taught instead was that grief itself is part of the passage. The death of an old identity, an old relationship, an old dream must be mourned before the new can be born. Only through that mourning can synchronicity find room to work. It is tempting to look back during this stage, to wonder if the collapse was a mistake. But Jung would remind us, what is truly meant to stay will never require force, and what departs is not theft but release. To trust this truth is to step fully into transformation. Chaos clears the ground. Synchronicity plants the seeds. Together, they weave the pattern of renewal. In the ashes of endings, life begins again, not by accident, but by a deeper order that reveals itself when we dare to become whole. At the end of Jung's journey, a profound truth emerges. The outer world is a mirror of the inner one. Everything we experience in relationships, in society, even in history itself, reflects what lives inside the human psyche. Projection, he argued, is not a flaw, but a clue. It shows us where we have not yet healed, where we have not yet embraced the fullness of who we are. This is why self-love is not a luxury or a sentimental phrase. It is a necessity. Without it, we remain trapped in cycles of dependence and resentment, forever chasing external validation. With it, life changes shape. When we finally treat ourselves with the respect we once begged from others, the people around us begin to shift. Those who cannot honor our worth drift away, and those who can match it are drawn closer. The insular field of our reality rearranges to reflect the vibration we carry within. The significance of this extends far beyond individual lives. History itself testifies to the power of inner awakening. Nations built on fear and denial inevitably project their shadows outward, waging wars and erecting systems of oppression. But when individuals begin to claim their inner worth through movements of dignity, through art, through voices of truth, the collective begins to change. Jung believed that the transformation of humanity depends on the transformation of the individual. Each act of self-love becomes a ripple that alters the whole. And yet, this call to awakening is not easy. It asks us to surrender illusions, to face solitude, to let go of the safety of familiar pain. Many resist, clinging to toxic relationships, to empty roles, to identities that no longer fit. But Jung would remind us that awakening cannot be forced from the outside. It can only be chosen. It begins the moment we stop betraying ourselves, the moment we decide that our peace is more valuable than our fear. This awakening is not about becoming flawless. It is about becoming true. To love yourself is to embrace not just the polished surface, but the cracks, the shadows, the forgotten corners of your being. It is to remember that the very wounds you once hid contain the wisdom you most need. Jung's words still echo. What you most need will be found where you least want to look. When we dare to look, something extraordinary happens. We stop chasing. We stop clinging. We stop begging for scraps of love. Instead, we begin to radiate from a place of fullness. And in that radiance, life responds. Opportunities flow, relationships align, synchronicities unfold. Not because we forced them, but because we finally stepped into harmony with ourselves. This, ultimately, is the call of individuation, not a path of ease, but of depth, not an escape from suffering, but a transformation through it. To awaken is to recognize that you were never broken, never incomplete, never unworthy. You were always enough. The only task was to see it, to live it, to embody it. And so the invitation remains, as urgent now as it was in Jung's time. Will you continue to search outward for the love and meaning you crave, or will you turn inward and claim what has always been waiting? The choice is yours, but the moment you choose, life itself begins to shift. Because the greatest power you will ever hold is not over others, but over yourself. And when you finally awaken to that truth, when you step fully into your own light, only those who are truly meant for you will walk beside you.